Hey everybody, this is Mr. Vaisaki. I hope you're doing well. I hope you and your families are healthy. This is our video overview for the content posted on Tuesday. You have an assignment, a video, and a few other pieces of content posted for Monday. So when you get to the end of this, if you haven't done Monday yet, take a look at it. And then after that, think about today's recommended topic for reading and writing. Now, today we are thinking about nature poetry. We're thinking about the environment and how it has influenced some poets and also you throughout time. And so, as we go through this, I want to talk about my writing sample for the topic response. I want to go over briefly three poets and their respective poems for the topic. And then also for this assignment, I have a couple of nonfiction essays that you could take a look at because it gives you a few more examples of authors who have considered their relationship to the environment in regards to contemporary poetry. So I'm going to talk a little bit about classic nature poetry, and then the articles provided, they make it a little bit more modern. They make it more recent for more current events that have happened in regards, again, to the environment and poetry. Now, when we think about nature poetry, it's important to keep in mind it has been around forever. Nature poetry, it allows us to use symbols from nature in our everyday lives to help illustrate these big, complicated concepts that otherwise we might have a hard time understanding. That's why one of the most famous symbols in literature, it's a rose. There's a reason that over and over again we have used a tree as a symbol, kind of the same way that they use it in Divergent. And as you think about every other text that you have read during your time at middle school, you're going to keep remembering all these different natural symbols that reappear. That's because we've been writing about nature and the environment ever since we were able to read and write. Before then, we were just talking about it more than anything else. But for the nature and the environment in poetry, the big time period that we got some of our most astounding and the works that stand the test of time, it's the Romantic period for the English or British poets right before the 1900s and right at the beginning of the 1800s. So, pretty much the 19th century. You might have a poem, Ode to the West Wind, by a poet like John Keats. Now, I talk about this poem and this poet, Keats, to make a point. Number one, poetry about the environment. It's so important because it is writing about lasting elements of nature that are still here to this day. Also, writing about poetry and the environment, it's so important that it's almost become a little bit cliche. Now, what I mean by cliche is that poems about nature and the environment, we have so many of them, it's almost kind of expected that if you see something beautiful out in the natural world, what? You're going to write a poem about it? It's the idea that if you're trying to write a silly poem, one of the first rhymes that might come to your mind will be roses are red, violets are blue, Mr. Vaisaki is weird, and I know this to be true. Now, maybe that's not exactly the poem that you were thinking about writing, but those opening lines, roses are red, violets are blue, we use them over and over again. Because if you go out into the natural world, more than likely you're going to see red roses and blue violets. Now, I could get really worked up about that. But it's important to keep in mind nature poetry is no less important because it is a little cliche. It's a little overused. It's always readily available if we need a topic for any of our poems. But first, you want to keep in mind that these elements we're talking about, red roses, blue violets, a wind that comes from the west across southern England, for the case of John Keats, They have been here before us. Likely, depending on the course of human history, red roses, blue violets, winds from the west, they're going to be here after humanity is long gone. Now, these elements of nature, these elements of the environment, they make a big impact on us. It's the idea that when the weather changes, that marks a period of our history that we can easily remember. You might think to yourself, oh, I remember back in the early 2000s because we had Hurricane Katrina. If you think back to the 90s, maybe you remember that great flood of 93 in southern Illinois and the Quad Cities. But everybody, there's all of these major moments from our lives that we use weather and the natural world to try and understand. Now, I've tried to do a little bit of explaining right here. Maybe I could have done a little bit of a better job. That is why you should take a look at the assignment and the writing sample that I put out there. I talk about each of the topics mentioned and I go into a little bit more detail. Also, take a look at the poems and the poets, all right? I have 3 recommendations for today. You should take a look at Some Questions About the Storm by Hilda. You should also take a look at Dynamic Positioning by Juliana, Spohr. And then finally, When Animals Leave This Place by Allison, Adelle, Hedge, Coke. You're also going to see links for 2 nonfiction essays. You are going to have the opportunity to read Nature Poems by John Filtstiner. That's a great overview of some famous nature poems. It's going to give you more poems to read. It's also going to give you a guide for each of the poems. So as you're going through interpreting and responding to the poem, you can have an idea of what other people thought so you can kind of check yourself. Am I getting an accurate interpretation in relation to other people? Or am I coming up with something completely new and maybe just coming up with my own original interpretation? And then for your second article, you're going to have Resisting Remaking by Melissa Tuckey. This is a good article because it talks about contemporary moments of environmentalism and poetry. So some events that have recently happened in regards to the environment and the poets involved who are responding to the situation, incorporating the events into their own poetry, or providing some analysis about what has happened. So take a look at today's topic. Think about the environment. Think about nature. Read my writing sample. Read the poems. Take a look at other work by the poets. Hilda, Juliana, Spohr, and then also that long one, Allison, Adelle, Hedge, Coke. Take a look at the articles by John Filtstiner, and then also that final one by Melissa Tuckey. And everybody, as you're going through this, do some reading. Make that reading lead into some writing. And while you're working on your writing, you should take a listen to the song River by Leon Bridges. Thematically, I think it's appropriate for today's topic, and overall, it's just good music. I hope you're doing well. I hope you and your families are staying healthy. If you need anything, please reach out through an email. If you want to schedule a Google Hangout, I'd be happy to do that. Go read. Go write. Enjoy your Tuesday.